How's it, guys? Today we're looking at one of the most infamously bad science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. The Eye of Argon by Jimtheis. Published in a fanzine in 1970, this is one of the worst stories ever written, at least if you listen to the blurb. The weather-beaten trail wound ahead into the dust-racked climes of the barren land which dominates large portions of the Norgolian Empire. And thus begins The Eye of Argon, one of the most infamously bad science fiction stories ever written. The story surrounding its creation and writing is perhaps more popular and more well known than the story itself. Story goes that in 1970, 16-year-old Jimtheis published his fantasy story, which is a rip-off of many Conan stories and many of the kind of sword and sandal movies, in the Ozfan magazine, a fanzine designed specifically for geeky science fiction nerds like myself. It was then found by a person who decided it was too funny not to share and gave it to her friends over a dinner party. Apparently it was the best dinner party they'd ever had, as they were all laughing their asses off by the time it ended. Her friend then asked for a copy, and it started to get circulated around. By the 1980s, it was being read aloud in many science fiction conventions, with a party game being designed where one or more people would read it, and the one who fell down laughing was the loser. It would then move on to another person who would read it until they fell down laughing, and another, and so on. But for the longest of times, it wasn't clear whether Jimtheis was actually a real person. People said that the story could not possibly be written by anyone in seriousness since it was so infamously bad. Misspellings, mistakes, all kinds of terrible sentence structures. It just was too bad to be real, surely. But then it was discovered that Jimtheis was indeed a real person, and the mockery that the Eye of Argon got led to him never writing another book in his life. Which is kind of sad, because the adventures of Grignard the accordion is actually quite a fun little tale. Yes, it is terrible, and yes, it is full of misspellings and bad sentence structure and some of the funniest lines of dialogue ever put into a book. And it also has weird little things that an amateur would do, such as chapter 3 has chapter 3.5, and so on. But it is an entertaining little book, if only to read what a 16-year-old thought would be cool at the time. And let's face it, how many of us can say that we had our stuff published when we were 16? Perhaps it is a better thing for us then that we weren't published, because I know my work at 16 was absolutely dreadful, and probably as bad as this. I do feel sorry for poor old Jimtheis though, because he never wrote again. Then again, with lines like gaping from its single obling socket was scintillating, many-fauceted scarlet emerald, a brilliant gem seeming to possess a life of its own. Or, as the young barbarian Grignard once said, "Aye, my people are not tarnished by petty luxuries and baubles." The sentences obviously looked like they were constructed for a Mad Libs magazine, but it's still an entertaining story. It has a sort of a structure to it, where Grignard the accordion arrives in a town and swiftly gets into trouble and must fight his way through an evil demon cult using the titular Eye of Argon as their worship device. And of course, there are plenty of buxom wenches, snivelling guards, and useless princes. There are many fun things that you'll like about the Eye of Argon, and I suggest if you enjoy really bad fiction and want to see what you might have written like as a 16-year-old, check it out and spare Jimtheis a thought every now and then. Unfortunately, Mr. Theis died in 2003. It is said, though, that he was in attendance at some of those conventions where the Eye of Argon was read. Perhaps he enjoyed the attention and publicity that his fun little story got, or perhaps he didn't. I'm hoping he enjoyed it, because it's hard not to feel sorry for Mr. Theis, or the fact that his claim to fame is having written one of the worst science fiction stories ever. As I always say, all writers are crazy, and none crazier than a nerdy one. Take a look at Grignard, the Accordion, a retelling of The Eye of Argon by Geoffbottone. Jeff took upon himself one of the hardest tasks in writing. He decided to take one of the most infamously bad science fiction stories ever written and turn it into something good. And I think he has more than succeeded. The Eye of Argon came to Jeff's attention in the late 1990s or early 2000s. Jeff, described as a game designer, LARPer, and big old nerd who writes stories about helpful cats, vampires and diners, and immortal mercenaries, was fascinated by the tale. Yes, it was as terrible as everyone said, but there was something about it that really spoke to him. And I think it's the same thing that spoke to me. Jeff couldn't help but feel sorry for Mr. Jimtheis, a 16-year-old who had his work published and mocked by thousands upon thousands of people. A mocking that was so terrible to him, he actually stopped writing. I know that if my work had been published at 16 and critiqued by thousands of people, it probably would not have helped my ego. My work at 16 was almost as bad as the Eye of Argon, the only difference being that I didn't use as many big words as Mr. Theis did. So Jeff decided to do the impossible. He decided to retell the Eye of Argon, to take the basic structure, which was actually pretty decent, and take the main plot running through it and turn it into a fun, entertaining, but not terrible fantasy story. And that's what he's done here with Grignard, the Accordion. Published in 2019, it takes all the fun parts of the Eye of Argon and adds more to flesh out the story. Grignard is no longer a horrible sexist. The female characters are a lot more fleshed out and relatable. And the vile villain is actually more of a person this time. He did keep some things from the original, like the fact that the prince's evil vizier gets killed twice, an oversight in the Eye of Argon, but something that is part of the plot in Grignard the Accordion. I can't describe what it's like to read a really terrible story and then to read its retelling, a retelling that took over 30 years to happen. But it is kind of a surreal experience, because it goes from really terrible and funny to actually really well written and still fun. I do wish, though, that Mr. Theis had written a bit more, because it would have been fun to see his writing style develop over the years. Perhaps he would like Grignard. Honestly, I think he would, because I think Mr. Geoffbottone really keeps the spirit of the Eye of Argon alive in his retelling. So now all that's left to do is to spare a thought for Mr. Jimtheis and head out to Amazon to buy Grignard the Accordion. It's a great little retelling, and as an added bonus, it even keeps the Eye of Argon in its entirety in the back. And as the last line of the Eye of Argon reads, "Long live the king."